Hello and welcome to the first video of this TypeScript series. If you follow the channel, well, if you don't, then you should go and check the videos and follow the channel. But if you follow the channel, then you know that the JavaScript series is completed and we are ready to move on to TypeScript. TypeScript is a way of adding static types to JavaScript code. So if you follow the JavaScript course or if you're familiar with JavaScript, you know that, well, you didn't see we were writing the types of variables, right? We were creating a variable and we were assigning a string, and in the next line we were assigning a number. We could change it as we wanted to, but well, this flexibility is okay at some point, but as it turns out, it can get very confusing to maintain large code bases. And when you make a little change in a JavaScript code, then you really need to be careful that this little change is not going to break anything else in your application. So TypeScript comes to the rescue and lets us inform in advance the type of our variables, functions, objects, and everything in our JavaScript code. But before we really get going with TypeScript, we need to understand how it works, right? So this video is about how TypeScript works behind the scenes, because you have a TypeScript file and then what do you do with this file, right? So we'll understand the compiler, we'll understand what goes in the compiler, what comes out of the compiler, and how we can set up a project to use TypeScript in a couple of different ways. Okay, so with that said, I think we can switch to the agenda and we can actually start working with our first little project in TypeScript. Here are the main topics we will cover when talking about how to start working with TypeScript. First and foremost, we will set up an NPM project, and from now on, pretty much all the series in the channel will start with an NPM project because we want to keep things isolated. We then talk about how we can set up TypeScript and configure TypeScript, and then we move on to writing our first TypeScript file and compiling it with the TypeScript compiler. And then we finish up by talking about tsnode and how we can use this to directly run TypeScript files from the console. Before we jump into the code, just let me present you a extremely summarized overview of TypeScript, just for you to understand the main idea or the main structure of a TypeScript project. So the cool thing about TypeScript is that you can add this incrementally to your JavaScript project and you can compile the TypeScript files into JavaScript files, right? So TypeScript can be adopted incrementally, and that's very nice for large JavaScript projects where you don't really have the option to rewrite everything to TypeScript in one go. If it's a small project, maybe that's possible, but if it's a larger project, that's probably not possible, and that's maybe even not what you want, because you really want to try things and understand how TypeScript works before actually using it in a large scale. So you have a couple of TypeScript files, which are nothing more than JavaScript code with static types. And in the next videos of the series, we will go through these static types to understand how to use them to actually represent and to type our code. And once we have these files here, the TypeScript files, when we run them through the TypeScript compiler, and tsc here is the command line command for the TypeScript compiler, the tsc command is going to look at our configuration, which is hosted in this tsconfig.json file, and based on this configuration, it is going to output a couple of JavaScript files, and if the configuration says so, a couple of type declaration files. So if we want to keep things simple, we don't need to have the type declaration files, for example, and then TypeScript just gets compiled into JavaScript files. What this does really is just removes the type annotations and it outputs JavaScript for us. Now, if there are some problems with the types, so let's say that this TypeScript file has some issues with types, then the TypeScript compiler is going to complain. It's not going to let things go through until you fix the types. And that's the main advantage of using TypeScript. It is this type checking at compile time and not at runtime. This is a great way of preventing bugs or some sorts of bugs, of course not all the bugs, but a good part of them, because the TypeScript compiler is going to check whether, for example, a certain variable can be undefined. And if you are trying to access a property of an undefined variable, we already know that this throws an error. So we can prevent this kind of errors by having this compile, or by having this type checking at compile time. Now, let's say that you want to also output the type declaration files, and these are basically the TypeScript files, but without the JavaScript code, right? So you can think of it like this way. So the TypeScript files is JavaScript plus types, and then what the TypeScript compiler does for us, it looks at the TypeScript, at the tsconfig.json file. It checks based on this configuration whether everything is in order with our code and the types that we have declared. And if everything is in order, it's going to split up this .ts file. It's going to remove the JavaScript code, is going to come to, the JavaScript code here is going to come to the JS file, and the types that we have declared, they are going to come to the .d.ts, or to the type declaration files. Of course, that's much better seen in practice. So let's jump to the terminal and to the IDE, and let's start working in our first TypeScript project. So I'm here at my IDE, and as you can see, there is nothing inside this intro TypeScript folder. All I did was create an empty folder and open the IDE in this folder. And the same thing here for the terminal. If I were to list everything that's inside this folder, there is nothing, right? So just to make sure that we are all on the same page, I am using the Node version 14 here, and I'm using NVM. So I think I will try to put the link somewhere up here where you can set up Node in your machine if you don't have Node, and how you can set it up with NVM so you can have different versions of Node as necessary. And also the NPM, I am running the version 6.14. Okay, so if you run the version 7, there are some differences in the package log file. There are, of course, other features and so on, and there are many improvements. But here I'm still with version 6 because I think that this may be the version that most people are using. I mean, I don't really know numbers. If you use npm 7 and Node 15 or 16, for example, that's also fine. Okay, so the idea here is just that I will initialize an npm project. And how do we do that? We simply type npm init-y. This is going to generate a package.json file for us, as you can see here. And it's going to have these contents, right? So if I were to switch here to the IDE, then the file should appear exactly here. And the only thing, well, that you can see here, we have a name, intro, TypeScript, we have a main file, we have some scripts and so on, but we are going to ignore all of that. I'm not really talking about customizing the project in a package.json file. I will just use this package.json file and this whole npm project as a container for our TypeScript project for this series. This also helps me, of course, to keep the entire set of dependencies of this project isolated from other projects in my machine. So if, like me, you have a lot of projects going on and you're trying new different stuff all the time, it may be the case that some projects are using TypeScript 4.1, another project is using TypeScript 4.2, another one is using 3. Whatever, and in order to ensure that we don't have any global dependencies, because, well, that's not really what we want, then we use this npm projects, which allow us to isolate the dependencies based on the package.json and package lock, or yarn lock if you're using yarn. So for our purposes here, we're going to be using npm. And here, the next step, so actually this was the first one here for the setting up an npm project. That was quite quick, right? So I'm going to mark this as completed, and we will now set up TypeScript. You will see that this is as quick as setting up an npm project. So here at the terminal, all I have to do is to install the TypeScript dependency, and I'm going to give it a number here, so 4.2.4. This is, I believe, the latest stable or the general available version for TypeScript, not the dev versions or the beta versions. And this is to make sure that we are all working with the same package, right? If you don't add this version here after the package name, then it is going to install the latest available version in your machine. And if you're watching this video in the future, which you will be because you cannot watch it in the past, but if you are watching maybe a couple of months from when I'm recording, this version will most probably be different and there may be some incompatibility. So to ensure that we are all working with the exact same package, then, or the exact same dependency, let's give the exact version here. Once I run this, you'll see it's going to take a little bit of time. So I'm going to fetch the project and oh, there you go. So it already added one package. And if we look here in my IDE, now you will see that I have TypeScript in my set of dependencies. And here I have a new node modules file, and this is where the dependency is actually installed. Now, one comment here is that you will see sometimes people say that they are going to put TypeScript in the dev dependencies. Sometimes they're going to put in the dependencies. And well, to begin with, I wouldn't make that big of a difference, or I will avoid discussing this more detailed issues here. To be 100% correct, or if your project, if you aim at running JavaScript in the end, then you can have TypeScript as a dev dependency, in the sense that you will use TypeScript to build your final code, but TypeScript is not a dependency of your final project, so it doesn't need to be in the dependencies. You can have it in the dev dependencies. But in any case, here, let's just keep it in the dependencies. I mean, it's just, if you want to be 100% correct, you can also do like this, dev dependencies, and what you would have to do here is to rerun the npm install command to update the package lock file. Okay, but I'm not gonna do that because for us it doesn't really matter. Now, I said that to set up TypeScript there were 2 lines of code, and yes, there is an additional line which we need to run to actually get a starting point for our configuration file. So if I were to come back here to my diagram, you see that we have this tsconfig.json file, but nothing was generated in my IDE. So I still have the package.json and package lock and the node modules, but I don't have any tsconfig. You can copy from the internet, it's no problem. If you want to copy a slimmer version from the one that is generated by TypeScript, you can do that. But if you want to just work with the file that is shipped by TypeScript, you can simply say npx tsc --init, and this is going to initialize the project. Now, npx is a way of running TypeScript without having to install it globally, because even though I have installed TypeScript in my project, if I try to run TypeScript like this, it doesn't work. And that's because TypeScript here, the one that was installed in my project, is not really in the global path of the executables of my command line. So if I were to run node modules.bin and then TypeScript, that works. Okay, as you can see, it works and it gives me a lot of outputs. So the TypeScript, this is a nice way of showing that TypeScript is installed locally and not globally, and that's exactly what we want. So a way of running TypeScript without having to run this whole .node modules, .bin and so on and so forth is to simply call it with npx, and this is going to run the command for us without us having to install it in our machine. And for TypeScript, to initialize our project, we can simply say --init. And as you can see, there you go, successfully created a tsconfig.json file. So now if I come back here to my IDE, you will see that there is a new file here, a tsconfig.json file. And there are quite a few options here. As you can see, many of them, they are commented out. But these are all the options that you can use to the compiler, right? So here, remember that when I said in this diagram, the TypeScript, the compiler looks at the configuration file, then it's gonna look at this config here, and it's going to output the JavaScript and the type declaration files according to the configuration that we give here. That's it for setting up TypeScript. We're actually pretty good to go. If you just want to run with the configuration out of the box, you could use that file directly, but I want to do a bit of configuration with you now because I want to change a few options. So the first one is the declaration one. So as you can see here, declaration is really commented out, which means that when I compile this code, when I generate the JavaScript files out of the TypeScript files, this is it's not going to emit any types, right? So this one I want to change, and the other two I want to change are the root where is it? Let me find it here. There are here, the root directory and the out directory. Right, so the out directory, what's going to do is it's gonna output the transpiled, it's gonna output the compiled code into whatever directory we specify here. If we don't specify any directory, it is going to output in the directory that we are running the project or the compiler. I don't remember, but the compiler is always going to run. Yeah, I think, well, we can actually give it a try. So instead of guessing, let's give it a try here. And I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this, or actually let's start with the simplest case ever. That's going to be just a file, and I'm going to call this main.ts. Okay, so this is a very simple TypeScript file which is going to have a greeting, and this greeting is going to be a string, and it's just going to say hello. Okay, and then I'm going to say console.log greeting, console.log greeting. And if you have never seen TypeScript before, well, the only thing that is different from JavaScript is this colon string, right? So this is simply saying that the variable greeting is going to contain a certain value, which has to be of type string. If I were to say 9, then you can see this already giving me an error, right? So the idea here is just we are informing beforehand that the variable contains a value of type string. Now, before I can run the TypeScript compiler, actually I could directly come here and say .node modules.bin tsc and run this command. And there you go. Now I have no weird output. Remember that before I had a long output, but now I don't have any weird output. And if I look here at my IDE, as you can see, there is a generated main.js file. If I were to list the files here, we have a main.js and we have a main.ts, right? So now if I open this, you see that the type here, the type declaration is gone, and all I have is JavaScript code. So this is pretty much how it works. And we can actually get a small shortcut here, which is by defining a script. If I call this, for example, let's say build, right? This normally the script that we use, or the name of the command, then we run the compiler to this code that is in this directory. So I'm going to delete main.js here again. I'm going to save the package.json file. And now if I'm here and I run npm run build, then this is going to do exactly the same. It's going to run TypeScript and it's going to output here, there you go, the main.js file. Okay, so now that we understand the basics of how this TypeScript compiler works, let's change a few configuration options in this tsconfig file. And for that, first of all, I just want to implement a little bit of a best practice that I follow in all of or most of my projects, is I put all the source code inside a directory called src, right? So here, all the files that are relevant for my project are going to be from the src folder. And if there are any files which are not relevant for the final project, so for example, some automatic formatting with prettier, some configuration stuff, some pre-commit hooks, or some other files which are more relevant for other aspects of the project, but not the final code, then I'm going to put them in the top level directory. But for us here, it's only really these 3 files that we're going to be using throughout the series. Maybe we add some one or the other towards the end of the series, but the most important ones will be this one. So now that I have the project here in the src folder, one thing that I can do in the tsconfig file is to actually inform the root directory. And actually, before I change this option here, and I'm sorry if it was a little bit too quick, but here when you open the file, it's going to be, you have the compiler options. If you scroll down a little bit, you have out directory and root directory here. So first of all, let's change the out directory before changing the root directory. And let's say that I want to output all the results of the build command inside of the build folder or dist folder, for example. It's very common if you're developing a library, maybe it's going to be the lib folder, but here we can say dist. And once I save this, let's come back here to the terminal and let's try to run npm run build. Once I run this, you will see that now the files, well, there is a new directory dist, and then here it contains the main.js file, right? So another possibility or another thing that I can do here to make sure that I have a good structure for the project is to inform TypeScript that the root directory is going to be the source directory. If I save this and then I delete this whole thing here and I run the code again, then you should see that again here I have a dist with a main.js file. Now, why am I doing this? Well, sometimes, and this happened with me already, sometimes when you are developing a TypeScript project and you run the compile, you see that you have some output folder here and you set the out directory and you say .dist, for example, but then this directory has one top level here, source, and then inside of the source there is your entire compiled code. Maybe this can be a problem if you are maybe just copying the outputs of the dist folder into another place to run this code and you are not aware of this structure. Then you may be wondering, okay, why am I getting the bugs? Why am I getting the source folder inside of the dist folder? So why is there a top level source directory directly under the dist folder? And that's probably because your project is not there correctly configured with the root directory. If you set the root directory to source, it just says, okay, the root directory of the input files is going to be the source directory. Okay, and then you should have a structure which mirrors this source folder here. So if I were to actually create a new folder here, let's say just, I don't know, test, right? So just a new directory with test, and I copy the main file here inside of this test directory, and then I delete this whole thing here from dist. Let me save this, and then I run npm run build. Once I run that, we're going to get a dist directory here, which is going to contain the test folder and then main.js. So as you can see, the directory structure from within the source folder is going to be mirrored in this dist folder. This makes sure that whatever imports you use here and whatever relative paths they are still working in this dist directory because the structure is maintained. Now, as you can see, we have just a main.js file. Now remember, here in my diagram, I said that we can have some type declaration files. And these files are basically the TypeScript files, but without the JavaScript code. So if I come back here, this would be something like this. So declare const greeting is of type string. There's a typo here, and that's probably something like this. Exactly. This would be kind of the shape of our .d.ts file. It's simply saying that the main.js has a string which is, or has a variable greeting which is of type string. This is more useful, or this is much more relevant if you are developing a project to be used somewhere else, maybe an npm library or an npm package, which is going to be installed by some other project, which is also using TypeScript. Then these type declaration files, they will be shipped with the library, and they will make sure that you have the full functionality of TypeScript when you are using your package somewhere else. Okay, if you are just building code to maybe ship in a server, so to run in a server, for example, then the type declarations are not that relevant, because what's important really is the JavaScript code. Nonetheless, here inside of the TypeScript, the tsconfig file, to enable declaration, I simply need to uncomment this line which says declaration to true. Okay, as you can see here in the comments, it says generates the corresponding .d.ts file. So, oops. If I were to save this and then run again my build command, and then return to my IDE, you will see that now I have a main.d.ts file. And if I open this, that's exactly the code that I wrote before. Okay, I'm getting used to TypeScript. This basically says that the main.js has a variable constant, right, which is greeting, and it is of type string. So These type declaration files, as I said, they are useful if this is going to be used somewhere else. But if you are running this, let's say, well, what I do for a few projects is when I have some automated CD or some automated deployment, I just run the build command. It outputs the TypeScript project as a JavaScript project inside of the dist or the build directory, and then this whole contents of the directory is copied to the server and then run in the server, right? So I'm not interested in the types there, so it can just generate the JavaScript code. Okay, so we actually talked both about configuring TypeScript and about compiling our first TypeScript file. Now, just as a comment, as you can see, there are many other options here, right? So some of them or many of them you will never see again, but others are actually relevant, right? So for example, types here you may come across when you're working with Jest and with Node. You may have to add Node and Jest here to make sure that the types are working correctly, or maybe you have I don't know, when you're working with React projects, you have JSX here, the option for React JSX files or TSX files. So if you are working in a hybrid project where you have both JavaScript and TypeScript files, you can mark this allow.js to true, and this is going to also allow you to have JavaScript files in your project. So there are many options. You can take your time to go through this. For us now, really the most important ones are the ones that allow to control the exact output and input of the project and whether we are going to generate types or not. So let me just come back here. I will just take main to source. I'm going to delete this folder. I'm going to delete this folder. And now let's try to run this, right? So if I were to come here and I say, let's say just for the sake of fun, just to get an error, node source main.ts. And oops, I get an error, of course. And here that's because I have a TypeScript code. Now, what happens if I don't have TypeScript code? If I don't have any TypeScript code and I save, this is still valid. And if I run npm, or sorry, node, maybe I clear the whole thing here because it's a little bit too at the bottom. But if I run node source main.ts, it works, right? So even if the extension is TS, if you have no TypeScript code whatsoever, meaning no type declaration whatsoever inside of this file, it will work directly with Node. If I were to run npm run build, you shouldn't be surprised that, well, this works. Okay, so as you can see, and it even gave me this .d.ts file here, which looks a little bit weird because very similar to our JavaScript code. As you can see here, the IDE is complaining, but it doesn't matter, right? Because it's generated code. But as you can see, it works, right? Even if we don't have any types or if we don't have any declaration types, it even executes with Node. But the moment that I start adding the types, then Node starts failing me because Node executes JavaScript files and I have some TypeScript constructs here. So one option is to actually run npm run build, right? It's gonna compile the whole project and it's gonna output this dist here and it's gonna have the main.js, and then I can run node dist main.js and this is gonna output the hello correctly. So here once again, and this one way that we can run a certain program, right? So, however, this is not the most practical way, because if I have a huge project and I want to run a single file, or I want to run that project, I would have to compile the whole project beforehand and then run the code from dist. This is not the worst thing in the world, but there is perhaps a slightly better way of doing that, and it's by using TS node. So one possibility, for example, let's say that this main.js here is a file that is starting, or the main.ts is a file that is starting a certain server, and I just want to run it with one command without having to run the build and without having to do a lot of work. One way of doing that is by using the TS node. So I will simply install this, and this is going to be TS node at 9.1.1. That's the version we are going to use. You can, if you don't add the version here, you can get a more recent package, which, as I said, may not be compatible to the commands we're going to execute in this video. But I think that really here is so simple that even later packages should be compatible. So one way that we can use TS node, so if of course I try to run TS node here, I will have the exact same error as before because TS node was installed inside of my local project, not globally in my machine. So one way of doing that is to use the node modules bin and TS node like so, and then I could give the directory source main.ts, and that's going to execute the code for me. There you go, hello. And as you can see here, I can directly execute like I use node to execute JS files. So one other way of using TS node is that, for example, you could have a start command, and this start command is going to run TS node and then source / main.ts, right? So let's say that main.ts maybe is starting up a server or something, and then you run npm run start or just npm start, because the start you can run like this, and it's going to run the file for us. We can also have, for example, if we want to have a more flexible command to run individual files, we could say exec or maybe even ts exec, and we would say just TS node here once I save this, and I think it's something like this, TS exec and then -- and the name of the file main.ts, because then this, whatever comes after the -- is passed as an argument to the underlying script. And as you can see, it also works, right? So if I want to run an individual file with TS node, but I don't want to install it globally, and you shouldn't really install it globally so that you don't have conflicts between packages, you can use this alternative. You can add the ts exec command to your npm or to your package.json file, and then simply pass the file that you want to execute after a -- right? So these are a couple of different ways that we can run TypeScript files with TS node, and also how we can run TypeScript files by first compiling them using the tsconfig.json file, outputting the main.js file, and then running it with Node. So these two ways, I think, are the main ways of running TypeScript code. There are other ways. So for example, if you were working with maybe you're developing a React application and you're using Webpack to bundle your whole code, and then in the end, actually Webpack is just going to output a bunch of JS files, right? It's going to take all the TypeScript files, it's going to do all the processing in Babel, blah, 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 and it's going to output a bunch of JS files that are going to be your application. So in the end, the process is still the same, and it's really important that you get a very good understanding of how this compilation process works and how it's going to help you. So just as a final note here, let's say, as I said, that I have 9 here. So now let's see what happens if I try to compile the code. As you can see, my IDE is already complaining here. It's saying that type number is not assignable to type string, and I know that, but I can see it. I mean, I have 2 lines of code. It's not that hard to see that there is a warning, but maybe you have 100 lines of code and you have a couple of complex imports and like files moving around and flying around in your directories, and you change something in one file, and you definitely don't want to go and check the other 99 to see if there are any warnings, right? So let's see if the TypeScript compiler catches this for us. And if I were to run npm run build, then let's see the output here. And as you can see, we get a very nice error message saying that in the main.ts file, in the first line, the type number is not assignable to type string. So this is it may seem a little bit ridiculous now that we have 2 lines here, but this is extremely powerful because, as I said, when you have a complex project with lots of files and lots of folders and lots of dependencies, TypeScript is going to ensure that at least the types are not breaking, right? And when you change something, if you change the shape of an object, if you remove a certain property of an object and you try to compile the code, TypeScript is going to tell you, oh, wait, certain file at certain line is trying to access this property of this object. There is an error, right? This property doesn't exist anymore. So this is really cool. And I think it's really, really helpful, and you should always, I mean, my opinion, right? As you can see, I'm a really big fan of static typing and TypeScript, and hopefully over the next couple of videos, I'm able to show you pretty cool ways that we can work with these features of static typing to make our program much, much easier to maintain and to scale over time. And that's it for this video. I know it was a little bit long, but I really wanted to give you a good understanding. I mean, it was not the longest video of the channel. I have longer videos, but anyway, it was a little bit long perhaps for an introduction, but nonetheless, I hope I was able to give you a good understanding of how the TypeScript environment actually allows you to write all these types, and then in the end to have a real JavaScript code and to have the type declaration in a separate file. With that being said, in the next video we'll start with the basics of TypeScript. I mean, if you look in the archive of the channel, there are some videos about TypeScript. They are good, okay? They are not outdated. You can watch them if you really want to jump into, like, go a little bit ahead. But I'm making a 2.0 version, let's say, so that here I can really have a more structured approach. Like there, I try to do with a React application, but that really assumes that you know React, right? So if you don't know React, then it's hard to follow. And here I thought it would make sense for us to discuss the basics, to kind of create a complete package of introduction to TypeScript, so that later on we can apply this knowledge to actually specific applications like an Express application or React application or anything else. Okay, so that's pretty cool, and I hope to see you here in the next video. If you don't want to miss it, then make sure to subscribe to the channel and you'll get a little notification when the video is out. So I'll see you then. Bye bye.